Hey guys, tonight we're going to wander very slowly into 1880s San Francisco, more specifically, into Chinatown. Not the neon-lit, souvenir-selling Dragon Gate version you might picture today, but the cramped, smoky, suspiciously damp one that existed after the gold rush glitter had mostly worn off and before urban planning became a serious hobby. And before we begin, if you enjoy this kind of extremely calm, slightly bleak, and probably too detailed history, remember to quietly subscribe. It helps, in a very low-energy way. Now, by the 1880s, San Francisco's Chinatown was already several decades old. Chinese immigrants had begun arriving in large numbers during the California Gold Rush in 1849 and later to work on the Transcontinental Railroad. Many had imagined mountains of gold and a swift return home as wealthy men. What they found instead was hard labor, crowded housing, and a steady supply of people who would prefer they didn't exist. Chinatown formed partly by choice and partly by force. Chinese immigrants clustered together for language, familiarity, protection, and access to goods from home. At the same time, discriminatory laws and hostility from white residents limited where they could live and work. By the 1880s, most Chinese residents of San Francisco were concentrated in a tight grid of streets near Portsmouth Square. The buildings were wooden, close together, and frequently subdivided into spaces that could generously be described as rooms. In practice, many were narrow compartments partitioned by thin boards. A single building might house dozens of people. Air circulation was optimistic. Windows were small, hallways were narrow. If someone coughed on one end of the building, it was a community experience. Fire was a constant fear. The structures were densely packed and often poorly maintained. Cooking was done over open flames. Oil lamps flickered in cramped quarters. One spark could turn an entire block into a very fast-moving problem. And yet, for many residents, this was preferable to trying to rent outside Chinatown, where landlords often refused Chinese tenants outright. Most residents were men. U.S. immigration policies and social conditions made it difficult for Chinese women to enter the country, and anti-miscegenation laws restricted marriage. The result was a bachelor society. Long rows of bunks lined the walls of lodging houses. Men slept in shifts, depending on work schedules. Privacy was theoretical. Work itself was repetitive and exhausting. Chinese immigrants in San Francisco were heavily concentrated in certain industries: laundries, cigar making, domestic service, small manufacturing, and restaurant work. Laundry was especially common. Steam-filled rooms, boiling water, soap, and the steady rhythm of scrubbing, rinsing, wringing, and ironing. 12-hour days were not unusual, neither were 7-day work weeks. Laundry had an advantage. It required relatively little English and minimal initial capital. But it was physically demanding. Hands cracked from chemicals and heat. Shoulders ached from lifting heavy, wet fabric. And customers, while happy to have clean shirts, were not always generous with respect. Economic pressure extended beyond the workday. Many immigrants had borrowed money to make the journey across the Pacific. Travel costs were high. Loans were often arranged through family networks or regional associations. Once in San Francisco, workers sent remittances home regularly. Supporting relatives in Guangdong Province was not optional. It was expected. Chinatown developed its own social institutions to manage this life. Clan associations and district organizations provided dispute resolution, financial assistance, and help with employment. These groups were sometimes labeled tongs in sensational newspaper stories which preferred drama over nuance. In reality, most daily interactions involved paperwork, mediation, and the careful balancing of limited resources. And all of this unfolded under a steady hum of hostility. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act had just been passed, restricting further immigration of Chinese laborers. It was the first major U.S. law to ban immigration based on nationality. The message was clear: you may stay, but no more of you are welcome. Anti-Chinese sentiment occasionally erupted into violence. Businesses were vandalized. Workers were harassed. Politicians gained popularity by promising to remove Chinese residents. For those living in Chinatown, uncertainty was a constant companion. Would there be new restrictions, new taxes, a riot? Yet, daily life continued in its stubbornly ordinary way. Grocers stocked dried fish, rice, preserved vegetables. Herbal shops dispensed traditional medicines. The smell of ginger and soy drifted into the street. Children, though fewer in number, attended small schools within the community. It was not glamorous. It was not cinematic. It was mostly routine. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. Letters written by dim lamplight. Coins carefully counted. Tea brewed strong enough to push back fatigue, if only slightly. And if you had arrived expecting gold and glory, you would instead find laundry steam, crowded bunks, and a city that tolerated you primarily as long as your labor remained useful. In the next part, we'll move even deeper into the texture of everyday life, into food, health, policing, and the slow bureaucratic weight of exclusion that shaped each ordinary day. Very calmly, very slowly. If you woke up in 1880 San Francisco Chinatown, you probably did not wake up alone, even if you very much wanted to. Morning arrived without ceremony. There were no alarm clocks in neat rows on bedside tables. There were voices in the hallway, the scrape of wooden sandals, someone coughing steadily, like an old engine that had no intention of improving. Steam from a neighbor's kettle slipping through thin walls. The day simply began, and you were expected to follow. Breakfast was practical. Rice, almost always. Perhaps congee, thin and warm, stretched carefully to last. Salted vegetables, maybe a fragment of dried fish if finances allowed. Meals were not decorative. They were calculated. Calories mattered more than flavor, though flavor, when possible, was appreciated in a quiet, restrained way. Food in Chinatown required constant negotiation with the outside world. Many ingredients were imported from China: dried mushrooms, tea, preserved plums, medicinal herbs. Ships crossing the Pacific carried not just goods, but familiarity. At the same time, local markets supplied pork, chicken, and fresh produce when affordable. Chinese grocers adapted quickly, incorporating American ingredients into traditional cooking. Cabbage, for example, became surprisingly versatile. After breakfast, most men left for work. The streets of Chinatown filled with motion, but not chaos. It was organized movement. Laundry workers hauling bundles, cigar rollers heading to workshops, thick with tobacco dust, domestic servants walking uphill toward wealthier neighborhoods where they would cook, clean, and remain largely invisible. Inside Chinatown, small workshops hummed steadily. In cigar factories, men sat shoulder to shoulder at long wooden tables, hands moving with mechanical precision. Tobacco leaves were sorted, cut, rolled. The air was dense, sweet, and faintly suffocating. Talking was minimal. Efficiency was survival. Health was a delicate subject. Overcrowding meant disease spread easily. Tuberculosis was common. So were respiratory illnesses. In rooms with limited ventilation and constant humidity, lungs did not thrive. Medical options were limited by both poverty and discrimination. Some Chinese residents avoided American hospitals, fearing mistreatment or misunderstanding. Instead, they visited herbalists within the community. Herbal shops were both medical clinics and cultural anchors. Drawers lined the walls, each labeled with careful characters: roots, bark, dried insects, powders. Prescriptions were mixed by hand. Remedies addressed imbalance, fatigue, coughing, stomach pain. They offered not only treatment, but continuity, a reminder that even thousands of miles from Guangdong, knowledge persisted. And then there was the question of law. Policing in Chinatown was inconsistent and often intrusive. Authorities treated the neighborhood as suspicious by default. Inspections were frequent. Officials claimed concern for sanitation and fire safety, though enforcement outside Chinatown was rarely as enthusiastic. The line between public health and harassment was thin. Newspaper coverage did not help. Local papers regularly described Chinatown as dangerous, exotic, morally corrupt. Sensational stories about gambling dens or opium smoking attracted readers. The reality was less theatrical. Gambling did occur, so did opium use. But these activities were neither universal nor unique to Chinatown. They were simply magnified under a harsher spotlight. Opium dens, when they existed, were usually dim, quiet rooms. Contrary to popular imagination, they were not constant scenes of chaos. They were subdued. Low platforms, soft murmurs, smoke curling slowly toward ceilings already darkened by years of oil lamps. For some laborers, opium was an escape from physical pain. For others, it was a social ritual. For outsiders, it was a convenient stereotype. Evenings brought a different rhythm. After long shifts, men returned to crowded lodgings. Some stopped at tea houses. Tea was more than a beverage. It was structure. Conversations unfolded slowly. Letters from home were read aloud. News traveled across oceans by rumor and by ink. Remittances were discussed with care. How much to send this month? Whether a cousin needed assistance? Whether a harvest back home had failed? The financial tether to China never loosened. Many still believed their stay in America was temporary. A few more years, a little more savings, then return home with dignity. But as exclusion laws tightened and hostility persisted, permanence became less a choice and more a quiet realization. You might not return as planned. You might grow old here in rooms that were never meant to be permanent. Despite hardship, Chinatown was not only suffering. Festivals were observed. Lunar New Year brought color into otherwise muted streets. Red paper decorations brightened wooden door frames. Firecrackers cracked sharply against narrow alleys. For a moment, noise replaced restraint, and then, gradually, normal life resumed. Steam, tobacco, rice, letters, work. It was a life defined less by dramatic events and more by endurance, by repetition, by the steady act of continuing even when the broader city preferred you, didn't. In the next part, we'll look more closely at family life, the rare presence of women, and how a bachelor society quietly reshaped identity and community in ways that were subtle but lasting. Very slowly, of course. Family life in 1880s San Francisco Chinatown was, in many cases, something that existed more vividly on paper than in person. If you walked through the neighborhood during the day, you would mostly see men, young men, middle-aged men, older men who had already spent decades telling themselves they would return home next year. The imbalance was not accidental. Immigration restrictions, economic hardship, and social barriers made it extraordinarily difficult for Chinese women to enter the United States. After the 1875 Page Act, officials increasingly targeted Chinese women under the assumption that they were entering for immoral purposes. The result was a community that felt, at times, suspended between worlds. Many men had wives in China, wives they had not seen in years. Some had left shortly after marriage. Others had children they knew only through letters, carefully written in brush and ink, folded and carried across the Pacific. These letters were read repeatedly, the paper softening at the creases. News of births, illnesses, harvests, village disputes, a life continuing elsewhere. Inside Chinatown, the absence of women reshaped daily routines in quiet but noticeable ways. Domestic tasks were often communal. Cooking might be shared. Laundry, ironically done professionally all day for others, was done again in smaller basins for personal use. There was little of the private family life that characterized American households of the same period. Where women were present, their lives were complex. A small number of Chinese women lived in Chinatown, some as wives, some as laborers, some under circumstances that were far less stable. Women who arrived legally often faced scrutiny from immigration officials determined to limit their presence. Interviews were invasive. Documentation was demanded in a system that was not particularly patient with missing paperwork. For married couples, space was still limited. Even family units lived in tight quarters. A single rented room might serve as bedroom, kitchen, and sitting area. Thin walls ensured that neighbors were never far from earshot. Privacy, once again, remained theoretical. Children, when they were present, occupied an unusual position. They were few, but highly visible. Born in the United States, many were American citizens by birthright. This fact created a subtle legal distinction between generations. A child might technically have more recognized rights than his father. It was a strange inversion, and one that carried both hope and tension. Education was complicated. Public schools in San Francisco were legally required to admit children, but segregation and discrimination were common. At times, Chinese children were directed to separate schools. Community leaders responded by establishing their own classes within Chinatown. Lessons included both English and Chinese. There was a practical understanding that survival required bilingual competence. Outside the neighborhood, the atmosphere could shift quickly from indifferent to hostile. Children walking beyond familiar streets risked insults or worse. Adults learned to navigate the city with caution. Chinatown functioned not only as a cultural enclave, but as a protective boundary. Marriage within the community required negotiation across oceans. Arranged marriages continued through correspondence. A man might return briefly to China to marry, then come back alone to America, promising to send for his wife once circumstances improved. Circumstances often did not improve as quickly as planned, and yet, within this constrained social structure, networks of support developed. Clan associations mediated disputes. They arranged funerals when necessary, ensuring that the deceased were buried with dignity, or, in some cases, that bones were eventually returned to ancestral villages. The idea of proper burial mattered deeply. Even in exile, tradition insisted on continuity. Religious life added another layer of quiet structure. Small temples stood tucked between commercial buildings. Inside, incense drifted upward in thin spirals. Offerings of fruit or tea rested before carved figures. Worship was not dramatic. It was habitual. A few minutes before or after work. A bow of the head. A murmured prayer for safety. For remittance money to arrive intact. For illness to pass. Meanwhile, the broader political climate continued tightening. The Chinese Exclusion Act did not simply restrict new arrivals. It reinforced the message that the existing population was conditional, temporary, tolerated, rather than welcomed. For a bachelor society, this uncertainty lingered heavily. Without families present, without long-term security, identity hovered in an in-between space, not fully accepted in America, increasingly distant from home. The dream of eventual return persisted, but it began to feel less like a plan and more like a comfort. So daily life settled into patterns of modest ambition. Save money, avoid trouble, work steadily, write home, drink tea, sleep in narrow bunks, repeat. In the next part, we'll step into the small businesses that quietly sustained Chinatown. Restaurants, barbershops, herbal stores, gambling houses, and examine how entrepreneurship thrived in spaces the wider city tried to confine. Calmly, of course. There's no rush. If you stood at the edge of Chinatown in the 1880s and simply watched the storefronts, you might assume the neighborhood was bustling with opportunity. Signs in Chinese characters hung above narrow doors. Windows displayed roasted ducks, bolts of fabric, bundles of herbs, lacquered boxes and jars whose contents were better understood by scent than sight. Entrepreneurship in Chinatown was less about bold innovation and more about careful survival. Restaurants were among the most visible businesses. Small dining rooms with wooden tables and simple benches served rice, noodles, stir-fried vegetables, pork, and seafood when available. The meals were affordable and filling. For Chinese laborers, these establishments offered familiarity. For a small but curious number of non-Chinese customers, they offered something described in newspapers as exotic, which usually meant different and therefore slightly alarming. Inside, the atmosphere was practical. Steam rose from woks. Cleavers struck cutting boards with a steady rhythm. There were no elaborate menus printed in elegant fonts. Orders were spoken, remembered, delivered. The goal was not culinary spectacle, it was nourishment. Barbershops operated in similar fashion. A chair, a mirror, a basin. Haircuts were quick and efficient. For Chinese men who maintained traditional cues, a long braid required under Qing dynasty rule, careful grooming was important. The cue was not merely hairstyle, it was political symbolism. Cutting it could signal rebellion back home. Keeping it could invite mockery in America. So it was maintained carefully, sometimes resentfully, always deliberately. Herbal shops, as mentioned before, were central to daily life. They were businesses, certainly, but also informal clinics. Customers described symptoms. Shopkeepers weighed roots and leaves on small brass scales. Advice was offered in measured tones. The smell inside was earthy, sharp, faintly bitter. Outside, observers often misunderstood these shops, dismissing them as mysterious. In reality, they were structured, systematic, and grounded in centuries of medical tradition. Then there were businesses that attracted more attention from the outside world. Gambling houses. Gambling existed in many communities in 19th century America, but when it occurred in Chinatown, it was framed as proof of moral deficiency. Games such as Fan-Tan drew participants seeking distraction after long work days. The rooms were not lavish. A table, a dealer, a small crowd leaning forward under dim light. Coins placed carefully, hopes briefly elevated, then recalculated. Police raids happened occasionally, often accompanied by newspaper reporters eager for dramatic copy. The pattern became predictable: raid, arrest, headline, release, resume. It was less a crusade and more a cycle. Opium, too, formed part of the economic landscape. Contrary to later caricatures, opium dens were typically quiet establishments. Clients reclined on low platforms. Pipes were prepared methodically. The atmosphere was subdued rather than chaotic. For laborers enduring chronic pain from physical work, opium offered temporary relief. For others, it was habit. For politicians, it was rhetorical ammunition. Beyond these more sensationalized businesses were dozens of smaller enterprises: tailors, cobblers, grocers, import-export brokers who navigated shipping routes between San Francisco and ports in southern China. Trade networks were surprisingly sophisticated. Goods traveled across oceans with careful documentation, linking Chinatown not just to California, but to global commerce. Credit systems operated largely within the community. Loans were extended based on reputation and clan ties. A man's reliability was measured in remittances sent home, debts repaid on time, conduct observed by peers. Formal banks were not always welcoming, so informal financial systems flourished quietly. All of this activity occurred within a few tightly packed blocks. The density created both resilience and vulnerability. Businesses depended on each other. A grocer supplied a restaurant. A tailor repaired garments worn by cigar rollers. A herbalist treated a cook's persistent cough. Money circulated in small but steady loops. Yet expansion beyond Chinatown remained difficult. Licensing restrictions, discriminatory ordinances, and social hostility confined many entrepreneurs to the neighborhood. The boundaries were not always written in law, but they were understood. Still, there was a certain stubborn creativity at work. When mainstream avenues closed, alternative paths were found. When customers refused service elsewhere, Chinatown provided it. When public perception hardened, internal networks strengthened. It was not a romantic entrepreneurial frontier. It was incremental, careful, calculated in copper coins and narrow margins. And as the 1880s progressed, these small businesses would face increasing pressure from legal exclusion, economic downturns, and the ever-present possibility that the city might decide Chinatown itself was a problem to be solved. In the next part, we'll look at that tension more closely, the politics, the proposed removals, and how an entire neighborhood learned to exist under the quiet threat of erasure, slowly, steadily, without raising our voices. By the mid-1880s, Chinatown was not merely a neighborhood. It was an argument. To its residents, it was home, crowded, imperfect, often exhausting, but structured and familiar. To many politicians and newspaper editors in San Francisco, however, it was described as a problem, a word that has a way of making people nervous, especially when attached to entire communities. Public debate about Chinatown rarely included the voices of those who actually lived there. Instead, city officials discussed sanitation, morality, fire risk, and property values. The language was technical. The implications were not. There were periodic proposals to relocate Chinatown entirely. The reasoning shifted depending on the audience. Sometimes it was framed as a public health concern. Other times, as urban improvement. Occasionally, it was presented as an act of benevolence, moving residents somewhere better. The underlying message remained consistent. The neighborhood was tolerated, but not embraced. Health inspections became a recurring feature of life. Officials entered buildings to examine ventilation, drainage, occupancy numbers. Overcrowding was cited as evidence of unfitness. What was rarely acknowledged was that discriminatory housing policies outside Chinatown had helped create that density in the first place. If Chinese residents attempted to rent elsewhere in the city, they were frequently refused. If they remained in Chinatown, they were criticized for crowding. It was a circular logic, delivered calmly in official reports. Meanwhile, the Chinese Exclusion Act continued shaping daily reality. It restricted new laborers from entering the country and required certain residents to carry documentation proving legal entry. Paperwork became essential. Certificates were guarded carefully. Losing one could mean detention or deportation. The process of proving one's right to remain was not simple. Immigration officials demanded evidence, witness testimony, detailed knowledge of family members, precise recollection of village geography. Interviews could stretch on for hours. Minor inconsistencies were treated as suspicion. The bureaucratic tone was polite, but the stakes were high. Inside Chinatown, this atmosphere produced a quiet vigilance. Documents were stored securely. Stories were memorized and repeated consistently. Clan associations sometimes assisted members navigating legal challenges. The community adapted not through protest alone, but through organization. At the same time, economic cycles added further strain. National recessions increased competition for jobs. Politicians seeking support often blamed Chinese workers for depressed wages. Campaign speeches promised action. Newspapers amplified grievances. Tension rose gradually, like water approaching a boil but never quite erupting every day. Yet life did not stop. Children still studied. Merchants still negotiated shipments. Laundry steam still clouded windows. The ordinary continued alongside the uncertain. There were also moments of resistance, though not always dramatic ones. Community leaders petitioned courts. Lawyers argued cases challenging discriminatory laws. Some rulings offered limited victories. Others reinforced exclusion. The legal landscape shifted slowly, unevenly. Socially, Chinatown maintained a careful balance between openness and protection. Visitors entered the neighborhood out of curiosity, sometimes escorted by guides who offered carefully curated glimpses of authentic life. It was both performance and survival, controlling the narrative when possible. But beneath the surface, residents understood the fragility of their position. Buildings were leased, not owned outright in many cases. Landlords outside the community retained significant power. If city authorities chose to condemn properties or enforce zoning aggressively, options were limited. And still, there was a certain steadiness. Festivals were planned months in advance. Businesses extended credit based on trust. Marriages were arranged through correspondence. Life projects continued, even under constraint. It would be easy to frame this period as constant crisis. In reality, it was more subdued. Pressure existed, yes, but it was chronic rather than explosive most days. A background weight, rather than a daily riot. Residents learned to measure risk carefully, when to speak, when to remain silent, when to invest, when to conserve. It was not heroic in the cinematic sense, it was strategic in the practical sense. As the decade moved forward, that tension between endurance and vulnerability would shape Chinatown's future in ways both visible and subtle. In the next part, we'll examine how identity evolved under these conditions, how residents balanced being Chinese, being in America, and being treated as permanently temporary, gently, methodically, with no sudden movements. Living in 1880s San Francisco Chinatown meant becoming very skilled at existing in between, not fully American, not fully able to return home, not entirely certain which future to prepare for. Identity, in this context, was not a philosophical debate, it was logistical. Most residents still considered themselves sojourners, temporary workers abroad. The plan, at least initially, had been simple. Earn money, send it home, return to one's village in Guangdong with enough savings to buy land, repair ancestral halls, perhaps elevate family status. America was a chapter, not the whole story. But as years stretched into decades, that chapter grew heavier. The Chinese Exclusion Act made travel riskier. Leaving the United States could mean difficulty re-entering. Paperwork might be questioned. Testimony might not align perfectly with recorded details. Some men who intended short visits home chose instead to remain in San Francisco, uncertain whether they would be allowed back. This uncertainty reshaped ambition. Investments became cautious. Savings were guarded carefully. There was always the question, is this temporary or is this permanent? Cultural continuity helped stabilize that ambiguity. Festivals followed the lunar calendar. Ancestor worship continued quietly in small temples and private rooms. Calligraphy adorned doorways. Language remained Cantonese in daily conversation. Children born in California often grew up bilingual, translating between their fathers and the outside world. At the same time, American influences crept in gradually. Clothing shifted in subtle ways. Some younger men adopted Western jackets over traditional garments. English phrases slipped into business transactions. Legal knowledge of American courts became unexpectedly important. Yet acceptance remained limited. No matter how fluent one's English, how diligent one's work, how careful one's conduct, social barriers persisted. Newspapers continued describing Chinatown as foreign, separate, inscrutable. Politicians continued framing Chinese residents as temporary labor rather than neighbors. This created a particular kind of psychological environment. You worked in a country that depended on your labor, but you were reminded frequently that you did not belong. Within that tension, pride endured quietly. Clan associations preserved genealogies. Villages back home tracked which sons had gone abroad and how much they had remitted. Letters praised perseverance. Success was measured not by American recognition, but by stability achieved for relatives across the ocean. Even funerals reflected this in-between identity. Many Chinese immigrants did not intend to be buried permanently in American soil. Arrangements were sometimes made for bones to be exhumed later and returned to China for proper ancestral burial. Death, like life, was organized with eventual return in mind. For younger generations born in San Francisco, however, the calculus shifted. These children were American citizens by law. They attended local schools, navigated city streets, absorbed cultural signals from both worlds. Their accents differed slightly from their fathers. Their expectations sometimes did as well. Intergenerational conversations could be delicate. A father might speak of returning home one day. A son might quietly imagine staying. Neither perspective was entirely secure. Religious life also adapted. Traditional practices coexisted with exposure to Christian missionaries operating in and around Chinatown. Some residents converted, others did not. The community's cohesion relied less on uniform belief and more on shared circumstance. Daily life, again, remained repetitive. Work, remittance, tea, sleep. But beneath the repetition was a slow negotiation of belonging. You might wake each morning certain of your obligations, earn money, avoid trouble, support family, yet less certain of your long-term place in the city surrounding you. And so identity became layered. Chinese in language and custom, American in geography and law, foreign in public perception, familiar within the boundaries of Chinatown's narrow streets. It was not dramatic most days. There were no constant speeches or declarations. Instead, it was a quiet recalibration, repeated over years. In the next part, we'll move toward the close of the decade and consider how these accumulated pressures, legal, social, economic, set the stage for profound changes in Chinatown's physical and symbolic landscape. Slowly, of course. History rarely hurries. As the 1880s edged toward their close, Chinatown remained where it had always been, compressed into a few crowded blocks, persistent in its routines, and permanently discussed by people who did not live there. But something subtle had shifted. The neighborhood had survived waves of hostility before. It had endured economic downturns, inflammatory speeches, and the steady paperwork of exclusion. Yet, by the late 1880s, the idea that Chinatown might one day simply be removed no longer felt entirely abstract. City planners and property owners occasionally floated redevelopment proposals. The land Chinatown occupied was valuable. San Francisco was growing. Real estate interests saw opportunity in improvement. The word sounded constructive. It rarely included consultation with residents. Still, daily life continued with its usual predictability. Laundry shops operated from early morning into evening, steam fogging small windows. Restaurants served bowls of rice and noodles to workers who counted coins before ordering. Herbalists filled paper packets with dried roots, folded precisely into neat squares. Cigar factories hummed. Clan halls convened meetings about debts, disputes, and remittances. Children practiced English phrases in small classrooms while also copying Chinese characters with careful brushstrokes. They moved more fluidly between worlds than their parents, though neither world fully claimed them. Meanwhile, documentation became even more important. Certificates of residence were guarded like heirlooms. Legal cases challenging discriminatory policies crept through courts at a pace that could generously be described as patient. Lawyers argued about constitutional protections while laborers continued washing shirts. Outside Chinatown, anti-Chinese sentiment did not disappear. It settled into policy, into enforcement, into quiet restrictions that made advancement difficult. Exclusion was not always loud. It was often procedural. Inside the neighborhood, resilience expressed itself not in grand gestures, but in maintenance. Buildings were repaired as best as limited funds allowed. Associations organized financial aid for members facing hardship. Merchants negotiated new shipping arrangements when tariffs shifted. There was also a gradual awareness that permanence, however unwanted by some city leaders, was taking root. Decades had passed. Businesses had generational continuity. Children had grown up on these streets. The idea of Chinatown as a temporary encampment felt increasingly disconnected from reality. And yet, vulnerability remained constant. Overcrowding, frequently cited in official reports, was both a symptom and a justification. Fires were feared, disease was feared, policy changes were feared. The neighborhood existed in a state of managed caution. What is striking in hindsight is how ordinary most days must have felt. There were no daily riots, no continuous spectacle, just routine, just work, just tea poured into small porcelain cups, just letters written carefully at wooden desks by lamplight. If you had walked through Chinatown on a random Tuesday in 1889, you would not have sensed that history was building toward anything dramatic. You would have smelled cooking oil, heard Cantonese spoken rapidly between shopkeepers, seen a child chasing another down a narrow alley before being called back inside. Life was incremental. For many residents, survival itself was the achievement. To remain, to earn, to send money home, to avoid deportation, to maintain dignity within constraint. And so the 1880s closed not with a dramatic ending, but with continuation. The pressures that had shaped Chinatown during the decade would not vanish. They would accumulate. They would eventually intersect with events that would reshape the neighborhood physically and symbolically. But for now, in this quiet moment at the edge of the decade, Chinatown persisted exactly as it had learned to do, cautiously, collectively, and with a kind of steady endurance that did not require applause. In the next part, we'll begin exploring how the physical environment itself, architecture, street layout, building materials, both reflected and intensified the realities of life in this dense enclave, slowly, methodically. There is no need to rush through narrow streets. If you looked at a map of 1880s San Francisco Chinatown, it would appear tidy. Straight streets, rectangular blocks, a rational grid system, as though the city had been assembled with careful measurement and civic optimism. Walking through it felt different. Buildings leaned slightly toward each other as if conspiring. Wooden facades weathered by coastal fog and smoke stood shoulder to shoulder. Balconies sagged gently. Laundry lines stretched overhead like improvised architecture. Shirts and trousers swaying in the Pacific breeze that occasionally found its way inland. Most structures were 2 or 3 stories tall. The ground floors housed shops, grocers, tailors, tea merchants. Above them, living quarters pressed into whatever space remained. Staircases were narrow and steep. Hallways were dim even at midday. Light entered reluctantly, filtered through small windows or open doorways. Ventilation was a persistent issue. With dozens of residents in a single building, air thickened quickly. Cooking fires added warmth in summer and necessary heat in winter, but also smoke. Oil lamps flickered against wooden walls, leaving soot in corners. The scent of rice, tobacco, dried fish, and damp timber blended into something distinctively local. Overcrowding was not an exaggeration, though it was often described in exaggerated tones by outsiders. It was practical density. Rooms partitioned by thin boards to create rentable spaces. Bunks stacked closely together. Personal belongings stored in trunks beneath beds. Privacy was negotiated through mutual restraint rather than walls. Water came from public sources or shared facilities. Indoor plumbing was rare. Chamber pots were common. Sanitation depended heavily on collective discipline. Residents understood the risks of disease, even if city officials assumed otherwise. Cleanliness was maintained as best as resources allowed, though limited infrastructure constrained outcomes. Fire remained the neighborhood's constant shadow. Wooden construction, open flames, tight spacing. These were not ideal conditions. Residents were acutely aware of the danger. Buckets were kept nearby. Neighbors were expected to respond quickly if smoke appeared. A single unattended lamp could transform routine into catastrophe. City authorities cited fire risk frequently in discussions about Chinatown's future. Sometimes the concern was genuine. Sometimes it blended conveniently with redevelopment ambitions. Either way, the building stood as both shelter and liability. Streets were busy but rarely chaotic. Hand carts rolled steadily. Deliveries arrived in modest quantities. Shopkeepers stood in doorways observing foot traffic. Conversations drifted between windows across narrow lanes. Portsmouth Square functioned as a kind of communal anchor. Elderly men gathered there to talk, to read letters, to observe the passing city. It was a modest open space amid density, a pause in the compression. At night, Chinatown transformed subtly rather than dramatically. Oil lamps illuminated storefronts with warm, uneven light. Shadows lengthened. The hum of business softened into murmured conversation. Gambling houses glowed faintly. Tea houses remained active, though quieter. From outside, the architecture was often described as foreign or exotic. In reality, much of it was adapted from standard San Francisco construction, modified under economic constraint. The otherness was frequently a matter of perception more than design. Yet the visual density did reinforce separation. Narrow alleys and layered signage created a sense of enclosure. For residents, it offered familiarity. For critics, it confirmed difference. And so, the physical environment did not merely house the community, it shaped its rhythms. Limited light encouraged early rest. Shared spaces encouraged collective habits. Tight quarters fostered cooperation and occasional friction in equal measure. It was not picturesque in the romantic sense, it was functional, improvised, maintained through necessity rather than aesthetic planning. If you stood quietly in one of those narrow streets and simply listened, you would hear work continuing, a pot lid clattering, a broom against wooden boards, soft conversation in Cantonese, the distant ring of a church bell from another neighborhood entirely. Chinatown existed within San Francisco, yet distinctly of itself, compressed, cautious, and continuously adapting to the pressures around it. In the next part, we'll look even more closely at daily routines from dawn to nightfall, following a single ordinary day through the lives of workers, shopkeepers, and children. Gently, step by step. There is no need for sudden movements. Let's slow everything down even further and follow a single, completely unremarkable day in 1880s San Francisco Chinatown. Nothing dramatic happens, which in many ways is the point. Before sunrise, the first movement begins in the lodging houses. A man in the upper bunk shifts carefully so as not to disturb the one below. Another rolls up his thin blanket and tucks it into a wooden trunk. Someone lights a small oil lamp, shielding the flame with his hand. The air is cool and faintly damp. A kettle is set over a small stove. Water simmers. Tea leaves are measured without ceremony. Outside, the street is still quiet, except for the distant sound of a cartwheel somewhere in the city. Breakfast is quick. Rice from the night before, reheated, pickled vegetables, tea poured into small cups. There is little conversation. Mornings are reserved for efficiency. By early light, doors open. Laundry workers step into the street carrying bundles of clothing tied in cloth. They walk uphill toward neighborhoods where customers wait for clean shirts and table linens. Their hands are already slightly raw from yesterday. In a cigar workshop, shutters are opened to let in a cautious amount of light. Men take their seats at long tables. Tobacco leaves are stacked neatly. Knives are sharpened with slow, repetitive strokes. The first cigars of the day are rolled in silence. A cook unlocks his restaurant door and begins chopping scallions. The steady rhythm of the knife sets the pace. Rice is rinsed in a basin. A large pot is placed over flame. Steam begins its daily work of fogging windows. Mid-morning, Portsmouth Square gathers its regular observers. Elderly men sit on benches or low stools discussing letters from home. One has received news of a cousin's marriage in Guangdong. Another worries about flooding in his village. The Pacific Ocean lies between them and these events, but the concerns feel immediate. Children walk toward a small schoolroom within Chinatown. They carry simple materials, slates, brushes, books. Lessons begin with Chinese characters. Later, English phrases are repeated carefully. The teacher moves between languages with practiced patience. By noon, the neighborhood hums steadily. Customers enter grocers' shops. Coins are counted. Dried fish is weighed. A tailor measures fabric for a new jacket. In the herbal shop, a man describes a persistent cough. The shopkeeper nods, selects roots from labeled drawers, and folds them into paper packets. Afternoon heat thickens the air. In laundry rooms, steam clings to skin. Shirts are scrubbed against washboards. Ironing begins, heavy metal pressing down on damp cloth. Outside, delivery carts return with payment or complaints. Occasionally, a city official appears, clipboard in hand, expression neutral. Questions are asked about occupancy, about cleanliness. Answers are given calmly. Documentation, when required, is produced with careful attention. As daylight fades, workers return to lodging houses. Shoes are removed near doorways. Hands are washed in shared basins. Some men stop at a tea house first, sitting at small wooden tables. Tea is poured. Conversations are quiet, practical. Wages earned today are calculated against debts and remittances. In a gambling room, a small group gathers around a table for fantan. Coins clink softly. There is no shouting, only focused anticipation. Elsewhere, in a family's rented room, a child reads aloud in English, while his father listens attentively, understanding only parts, but proud nonetheless. The oil lamp flickers gently between them. Dinner resembles breakfast in its simplicity. Rice, vegetables, perhaps pork if fortune has been kind. After eating, some men write letters. Brush and ink move steadily across thin paper. News is shared. Money enclosed when possible. Night deepens. Lamps are extinguished one by one. Bunks fill again. The sounds of the street quiet to a low murmur. Nothing extraordinary has occurred. No gold has been discovered. No riots have erupted. No grand speeches have been delivered. Only work completed, meals consumed, letters written, coins counted. And this repetition, this steady, almost monotonous persistence, is what defined life for many in 1880's San Francisco Chinatown. Not spectacle, not constant drama, just endurance measured in small daily increments. In the next part, we'll gently step back and consider how outsiders perceived all of this ordinary life, and how those perceptions often diverged sharply from reality. Slowly, as always. If you had never set foot inside Chinatown in the 1880s and instead relied entirely on newspapers, you would have imagined something far more theatrical than reality. Newspaper headlines preferred adjectives: mysterious, sinister, unfathomable. The quieter details of daily laundry work did not sell copies. Steam rising from boiling shirts was not considered newsworthy. A man writing a letter home by lamplight did not inspire outrage or fascination. So instead, stories emphasized gambling raids, opium pipes, secret societies, and narrow alleys described as though they were mazes designed for moral collapse. To be fair, some of these elements did exist. Gambling houses operated. Opium was smoked. Clan associations occasionally engaged in disputes that escalated beyond polite mediation. But these were fragments of a much larger picture. Outside observers often mistook the fragment for the whole. Tourism, in its early and slightly awkward form, also emerged. Curious visitors ventured into Chinatown escorted by guides who pointed out authentic scenes. Sometimes the scenes were staged. Sometimes they were simply ordinary moments reinterpreted as exotic spectacle. A tea house became an oriental curiosity. A temple became a mystic shrine. A quiet herbalist mixing roots became evidence of arcane ritual rather than practical medicine. This gaze, curious, suspicious, selective, shaped public opinion. Meanwhile, Chinese residents understood they were being watched. Behavior in public spaces was often measured. Interactions with officials were cautious. Reputation mattered not only within the community, but in how the neighborhood might be portrayed collectively. There was also an economic dimension to perception. Chinatown's difference could be condemned in political speeches and simultaneously marketed as an attraction. Visitors bought souvenirs. They tasted unfamiliar foods. They left with stories that reinforced preconceived ideas. It was a peculiar dynamic, criticized as alien yet consumed as novelty. In political discourse, Chinatown was framed as separate from the American body. Politicians argued that Chinese laborers depressed wages, that their customs were incompatible, that exclusion was necessary for national integrity. These arguments rarely paused to examine how deeply Chinese labor had already shaped California's infrastructure and economy. In reality, Chinatown functioned less like a secret enclave and more like any other working-class district, compressed, industrious, imperfect. Children studied. Men worked long hours. Merchants balanced accounts. People aged. People died. These universal experiences did not make headlines. The distance between perception and reality created tangible consequences. Policies were justified based on caricatures. Inspections intensified. Restrictions hardened. The community's image influenced its treatment. And yet, within Chinatown, daily routines continued almost unaffected by editorial exaggeration. A sensational article did not stop rice from being cooked. It did not prevent remittance money from being wrapped carefully in paper before shipment. There is something quietly revealing about this disconnect. Outsiders imagined drama. Insiders experienced repetition. Outsiders emphasized difference. Insiders focused on continuity. If you walk through Chinatown at dusk after reading a particularly alarmist newspaper article, you might expect chaos. Instead, you would hear the gentle clink of porcelain cups in a tea house, the shuffle of sandals against wooden floors, The murmur of conversation about prices, about weather, about family. It was not a stage set for mystery, it was a neighborhood managing survival under scrutiny. In the next part, we'll explore how that scrutiny occasionally turned into legal confrontation, how court cases, documentation battles, and bureaucratic interviews became as defining to life in Chinatown as steam and rice. Slowly, with the patience paperwork demands. If steam and rice defined the physical texture of daily life, paperwork defined its invisible weight. By the late 1880s, living in Chinatown increasingly meant proving, repeatedly and calmly, that you had the right to be there. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 had already restricted new laborers from entering the United States, but enforcement grew more detailed over time. Documentation became central. Certificates of residence, proof of prior entry, witness testimony. These were not abstract legal concepts. They were items to be folded carefully and stored where fire or theft would not easily reach them. Imagine finishing a 12-hour day in a laundry room only to spend the evening reviewing the details of your own biography. What year did you arrive? On which ship? From which village? Who witnessed your entry? Who can confirm your employment? The answers needed to be precise, consistent, and repeatable. A misplaced date could invite suspicion. Immigration officials conducted interviews that were often exhaustive. They asked about family trees, about the layout of ancestral homes, about how many steps led from one room to another. Questions that felt less like conversation and more like interrogation disguised as administration. Some residents faced detention while their status was reviewed. These detentions did not always involve dramatic arrests in the street. Sometimes they were quiet summons to an office followed by days or weeks of uncertainty. Clan associations and community leaders responded pragmatically. They organized support. They gathered witnesses. They advised members on how to prepare for questioning. Legal defense funds were assembled through small contributions. No one had excess wealth, but many contributed modestly. Lawyers, some Chinese, some not, began challenging discriminatory enforcement in court. Cases wound their way upward, arguing over constitutional protections, over equal application of law, over the definition of citizenship itself. These court battles were rarely swift. They moved at the pace of paperwork. Months passed. Years passed. Meanwhile, daily life continued. There was also the constant concern about travel. If a resident left the United States to visit family in China, re-entry was not guaranteed. The paperwork required for return grew more complicated. Some men chose to remain in San Francisco rather than risk separation from their livelihoods. The idea of a temporary sojourn became increasingly constrained by legal boundaries. For those born in the United States, legal status was somewhat clearer. Citizenship by birth offered a measure of protection. Yet even then, documentation was required. Birth records had to be located, certified, preserved. Bureaucracy did not entirely disappear. Within Chinatown, awareness of the law was practical rather than philosophical. People discussed which officials were more lenient, which offices processed applications faster, which lawyers had won recent cases. Legal knowledge circulated alongside gossip and shipping news. And yet, the process remained emotionally taxing. To live under constant verification is to live with subtle tension, not necessarily visible in posture or voice, but present in the careful way documents are handled, in the reluctance to travel, in the habit of memorizing personal details. It did not replace work. It layered over it. After ironing shirts all day, you might return to your bunk and rehearse your rival story quietly in your head. After closing a restaurant at night, you might double-check that your certificate was still tucked inside its protective wrapper. The city around Chinatown debated policy in legislative chambers. Inside the neighborhood, policy translated into daily caution, and still, as always, the ordinary persisted. Rice was cooked, tea was poured. Letters were written home describing work, not always describing worry. In the next part, we'll consider how all of these accumulated pressures, economic, architectural, legal, social, formed the foundation upon which the next era of Chinatown would be built. Calmly, without rushing ahead of our lamplight. By the end of the 1880s, Chinatown had become something paradoxical. It was both fragile and deeply rooted, temporary in theory, permanent in practice, marginalized in politics, yet essential in labor. Decades had passed since the first large waves of Chinese immigrants arrived during the gold rush. Many of the men now walking those narrow streets had gray in their hair. Some had spent more years in San Francisco than in the villages they still called home. And yet the language of temporary never quite disappeared. City officials continued to debate the neighborhood's future. Reformers spoke about sanitation and moral uplift. Business leaders spoke about redevelopment. Politicians spoke about American labor. None of them particularly spoke about what would happen to the people who lived there if Chinatown were erased. Inside the district, however, there was no abstract debate. There was maintenance. Wooden beams were repaired, roofs were patched, associations kept ledgers of debts and remittances. Children grew into adults who no longer remembered Guangdong except through stories. A second generation was slowly emerging, though smaller than it might have been under different immigration laws. The bachelor society persisted, but with subtle changes. Some men accepted that they would never return permanently to China. They adjusted their expectations accordingly. Investments in small businesses became slightly more confident. Relationships with local suppliers more stable. The idea of building something lasting in San Francisco felt less like betrayal and more like practicality. At the same time, exclusion tightened the boundaries of growth. New immigration restrictions meant fewer new arrivals. The population stabilized, even declined in some years. Chinatown did not expand outward. It condensed inward. This compression reinforced community ties. With limited room to disperse, networks strengthened. Clan associations grew more structured. Dispute resolution became more formalized. Community leadership developed in response to both internal needs and external pressure. It is easy, from a distance, to reduce this era to hostility and hardship. Those elements were certainly present. But what is equally notable is the steadiness. Most days were not marked by violence or spectacle. They were marked by repetition. A shop opened, a debt was repaid, a letter arrived from overseas, a child learned a new English word. A man sent $5 home instead of $3 because business had been slightly better that week. This incremental progress rarely made headlines. It did not alter national policy, but it altered lives. The architecture remained wooden and vulnerable. The air remained thick in summer. The legal climate remained uncertain. Yet, within these constraints, a rhythm endured. By 1890, Chinatown was no longer merely a cluster of recent immigrants hoping to strike gold. It was a structured urban community with economic systems, educational efforts, religious institutions, and legal strategies, still scrutinized, still restricted, but undeniably established. And perhaps that is the quietest revelation of all. The 1880s were not a single dramatic chapter of persecution, nor a romantic tale of exotic streets. They were a decade of ordinary endurance, of steam and paperwork, of rice and remittances, of careful adaptation under watchful eyes. If you had lived there, you might not have described your life as historic. You would have described it as tiring, repetitive, necessary. You would have known the exact weight of a bundle of wet laundry, the smell of tobacco, leaves at dawn, the feel of folded certificates tucked safely into cloth. And you would have risen the next morning, as always, to begin again. In the next part, we'll gently widen our view and reflect on how the 1880s laid the groundwork for the transformations Chinatown would undergo in the decades to follow, physically, politically, and symbolically, slowly, quietly, as history prefers. When we gently widen our view beyond the 1880s, something becomes clearer in retrospect, though it would not have felt clear at the time. Chinatown had crossed a threshold, not a dramatic one, not marked by ceremony, but a threshold nonetheless, from improvised survival toward reluctant permanence. The forces pressing against the neighborhood were not going away. Exclusion would deepen in the 1890s. Documentation requirements would become even stricter. Legal battles would intensify. The city's appetite for redevelopment would not diminish. And yet, the community had already developed habits that would allow it to persist. Organizational structure existed. Clan associations were not merely social clubs. They were administrative systems. They tracked arrivals, mediated disputes, organized loans, arranged funerals, assisted in legal cases. In a world where external institutions often excluded Chinese residents, internal institutions filled the gaps. Economic specialization had also matured. Laundry, restaurants, cigar manufacturing, import-export trade, these were no longer tentative ventures. They were established niches within the broader San Francisco economy. Even prejudice created a strange form of stability. Being confined to a few blocks meant commercial density. Customers seeking Chinese goods knew exactly where to go. Employers seeking laundry services knew whom to call. The boundaries that limited opportunity also concentrated it. Children born in the 1870s and 1880s would grow into adults at the turn of the century. They would speak English more comfortably than their fathers. They would understand American legal systems with greater familiarity. They would navigate two identities not as conflict, but as routine. The bachelor society would slowly shift as well. Though immigration restrictions limited family reunification, marriages continued through correspondence and occasional return trips when possible. Some wives did eventually arrive. Some children were raised entirely in San Francisco. The demographic imbalance softened, though never fully corrected. Architecturally, the vulnerability remained. Wooden buildings, tight quarters, fire risk, these would continue to shadow the district. Yet improvements were made where possible. Repairs were constant. Maintenance was unglamorous but relentless. Perhaps most significant was the psychological adjustment. The dream of returning home wealthy had faded for many. In its place came a quieter goal. Stability, not glory, not dramatic success, just continuity. To maintain a shop for 20 years, to send consistent remittances, to see a son complete schooling, to avoid deportation, these became markers of achievement. From the outside, Chinatown might still have been framed as temporary or alien, but internally, it had developed the characteristics of any long-standing urban neighborhood: institutions, routines, generational memory. If you stood in Portsmouth Square at dusk in 1890, you would see elderly men who had arrived in the 1850s sitting beside young boys born on California soil. Between them lay decades of adjustment. The steam still rose from laundry rooms, tea still poured from small pots, cigar leaves still rustled at long tables, but beneath these steady surfaces, something foundational had solidified. The 1880s, then, were not merely a time of restriction. They were a decade in which endurance became infrastructure. And infrastructure, quiet, repetitive, almost boring, is what allows communities to survive shocks that have not yet arrived. In the next part, we will gently reflect on how memory shapes our understanding of this era, how later generations would remember, romanticize, or simplify a decade that, for those who lived it, felt mostly like work. Slow work, repeated daily. Memory is rarely as methodical as daily life. When later generations looked back at 1880s Chinatown, they did not always see steam-filled laundry rooms or men carefully folding certificates of residence into cloth wrappers. They saw lanterns. They saw narrow alleys. They saw something that could be described conveniently as picturesque. It is easier to remember symbols than routines. By the early 20th century, Chinatown would be reframed, sometimes as a curiosity for tourists, sometimes as a symbol of immigrant perseverance, sometimes as an exotic enclave preserved within a modern city. In that reframing, the texture of the 1880s was softened. The repetition disappeared. The exhaustion faded from view. The legal tension became a footnote rather than a daily anxiety. But for those who had lived through that decade, there was little romantic about it. They would have remembered the weight of damp shirts lifted from wash tubs, the careful counting of coins before rent was paid, the anxiety of a knock at the door that might signal inspection, the quiet relief when paperwork was returned without objection. They would have remembered how narrow the bunks felt in summer heat, how thick the air could grow when too many stoves burned at once, how letters from Guangdong arrived months late, already carrying old news. And yet, they also would have remembered small satisfactions. A week when business was slightly better, a child mastering a new English phrase, a festival day when red paper brightened wooden doorways and firecrackers briefly drowned out political speeches happening elsewhere in the city. Memory compresses decades into themes, but lived experience stretches them into days. For historians, the 1880s may represent exclusion, hostility, and adaptation. For residents, it represented Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday. It represented waking early, boiling rice, scrubbing fabric, measuring tobacco leaves, writing remittances, memorizing details for potential interviews. It represented endurance without spectacle. There is something quietly instructive about that. Communities are not sustained by constant heroism. They are sustained by maintenance, by repetition, by habits that appear unremarkable until they are viewed from a distance. Chinatown in the 1880s was not a dramatic frontier. It was not a lawless underworld. It was a working-class neighborhood negotiating exclusion with organization and routine. If you drift through it in your imagination now, very slowly, you can almost hear the steady rhythm that defined it, the scrape of a chair on wooden floors, the murmur of Cantonese across an open window, the soft exhale of steam escaping a laundry room at dusk. No grand speeches, no cinematic crescendos, just the persistent act of continuing. In the next part, we'll gently close our walk through this decade by considering what it might have felt like personally to age there, to grow older in a place that was never meant to be permanent, yet became home nonetheless. Slowly, with no urgency at all. To grow old in 1880s, Chinatown was to experience time in a very particular way. You might have arrived in your 20s, strong enough to lift wet bundles of laundry without complaint. You might have told yourself that America was temporary, a contract, a chapter. 5 years, perhaps 10. Just long enough to secure savings and return home with dignity. Then one day, you would notice your hands were not as steady as they once were. The work did not necessarily grow lighter. Shirts still needed scrubbing, tobacco still required rolling, accounts still required balancing, but your shoulders might ache longer in the evenings. Your cough might linger through winter instead of passing in a week. Aging in Chinatown meant aging in shared space. There were no quiet suburban porches, no private studies overlooking gardens. There were narrow bunks and thin partitions. There were benches in Portsmouth Square where older men gathered to sit, talk, and watch younger workers hurry past. For many elderly residents, the square became a kind of open-air living room. Mornings were spent discussing news from China. Afternoons were quieter, conversation drifting toward memory. Which village had the best harvests in the 1860s? Which cousin had married well? Which ship had been the roughest crossing? Memory softened certain hardships and sharpened others. Some older men still spoke confidently about returning home next year. Others, more quietly, understood that return was unlikely. Travel was expensive, legal re-entry uncertain, savings never quite sufficient, years accumulated without dramatic announcement. And yet, dignity was preserved in small ways. Clan associations often ensured that elderly members were not entirely alone. Communal meals were shared. Contributions were collected when someone could no longer work. When death came, as it inevitably did, it was handled with ceremony, even if modest. Funeral rites mattered deeply. Incense burned steadily. Offerings were placed carefully. There was discussion sometimes about eventual exhumation and return of remains to ancestral soil. The idea that one's bones might rest in China, even if one's final breath occurred in San Francisco, carried emotional weight. For those who accepted permanence in America, a different adjustment unfolded. Perhaps a son had been born in California and now spoke English with ease. Perhaps that son spoke of business expansion rather than eventual return. Perhaps he described himself as both Chinese and American without hesitation. An aging father might listen with a mixture of pride and quiet disorientation. The America that had once been a workplace had become his child's homeland. Meanwhile, the city outside Chinatown continued evolving. Streetcars expanded routes. Buildings grew taller, industry diversified. And yet, within those few blocks, the rhythm remained steady. Rice still boiled at dawn. Tea still poured in small cups. Letters still arrived months late from villages that now felt both distant and immediate. To age, there was to measure time not by political speeches, but by cycles of remittance, by how many Lunar New Years you had observed away from home, by how many times you had repaired the same wooden door. It was not a glamorous old age. It was not adorned with public recognition. But it was structured, supported quietly by community, held together by habit and shared memory. And perhaps that is the most fitting way to understand 1880's Chinatown, not as spectacle, not as legend, but as a place where people rose each morning under constraint, worked steadily, adjusted carefully, and grew older without dramatic acknowledgement. If you were to lie down now in one of those narrow bunks, purely in imagination, of course, you would hear the soft murmur of voices fading, the distant clatter of a cartwheel, the faint scent of rice lingering in the air, and tomorrow, as always, the kettle would boil again. If we step back one final time, very gently, what remains is not a single event, but a pattern. 1880's San Francisco Chinatown was not defined by one riot, one speech, or one law alone. It was defined by accumulation of work, of restriction, of adaptation, of small, repeated decisions made under pressure. From the outside, it may have appeared dense and foreign. From within, it was structured and familiar. The narrow streets were not a maze to those who walked them daily. The wooden staircases were climbed without hesitation. The herbal drawers were opened with confidence. Life there required a certain steadiness of temperament. You learned not to expect dramatic fairness. You learned not to rely on public sympathy. You learned instead to rely on your association, your shop, your bunkmate, your own hands. In many ways, Chinatown functioned as an ecosystem. Each part supported another. The restaurant relied on the grocer relied on the importer relied on shipping routes that spanned the Pacific. Clan halls connected individuals to both local aid and distant villages. It was fragile, yes. Fire could undo years of effort. A legal decision could complicate residency overnight. An economic downturn could thin already narrow margins. And yet, it endured through systems rather than spectacle. If you could walk those streets now, quietly, respectfully, you would not find dramatic confrontation in every doorway. You would find men bent over work tables, children repeating vocabulary, shopkeepers measuring dried mushrooms on small brass scales. You would hear Cantonese spoken rapidly and occasionally interrupted by careful English phrases. You would smell tobacco, rice, ginger, damp wood. You would notice how close everything was, how compressed, how communal, and you might begin to understand that the story of 1880's Chinatown is not one of constant upheaval, but of calibrated persistence. It was a community shaped by exclusion, certainly, but it was also shaped by discipline, by routine, by the decision, repeated daily, to continue. History often favors the loudest moments, the conflicts, the speeches, the dramatic turning points. But if you truly want to understand what life was really like in 1880's San Francisco Chinatown, you must pay attention to the quiet hours, the early morning kettle, the afternoon inspection, the evening letter home, the careful folding of documents before sleep. That is where most of life unfolded. And so, as we let this decade settle into stillness, there is no grand conclusion, no triumphant resolution, only a neighborhood at dusk. Steam drifting upward, coins counted softly, voices lowering as oil lamps flicker out. Tomorrow, the routine begins again. TT. There is something almost meditative about repetition, especially when it stretches across years. By the late 1880s, Chinatown's residents had become experts in routine, not because routine was glamorous, but because it was stabilizing. When laws shifted unpredictably, when newspapers exaggerated, when politicians debated your existence, routine offered something solid. You woke, you worked, you sent money home, you avoided unnecessary attention, you attended festivals when they arrived, you repaired what broke. This rhythm created a kind of quiet resilience that rarely announces itself. If a new ordinance required additional documentation, you gathered it. If a landlord raised rent, you recalculated expenses. If a shipment from China was delayed, you substituted ingredients and adjusted menus. Adaptation was not celebrated, it was expected. Within the crowded lodging houses, social rules emerged organically. Respect others' sleep. Share space carefully. Keep personal disputes from escalating. Cooperation was not optional when walls were thin and bunks were inches apart. Even disagreements followed structure. Clan associations mediated conflicts to prevent fragmentation. Reputation mattered. To be known as reliable, someone who paid debts, honored agreements, avoided unnecessary trouble, was a form of currency. And over time, this collective discipline shaped the neighborhood's character. Chinatown did not expand dramatically in the 1880s. It consolidated. Its streets grew more layered with memory. A shop that once belonged to one proprietor passed to another. Within the same network, a young boy who ran errands in a grocery might later manage it. Continuity quietly replaced improvisation. For those who had arrived decades earlier, there was a subtle transformation in how they spoke about the city. San Francisco was no longer simply Gold Mountain, a temporary site of extraction. It was a place where years had accumulated, where friendships had formed, where graves, even if intended for eventual return, had been temporarily dug. Still, caution never disappeared entirely. Documents remained guarded. Travel decisions were weighed carefully. Public behavior remained measured. The knowledge that acceptance was conditional lingered in the background. But perhaps that knowledge also reinforced solidarity. When you know the wider society questions your presence, internal cohesion becomes practical. Festivals take on added meaning. Rituals matter more. Language becomes a bridge rather than merely a habit. And so, if you drift slowly through Chinatown at the end of this decade, you sense neither despair nor triumph. You sense steadiness. A cook wiping down his counter before closing. A laborer folding a freshly ironed shirt with precise corners. A father listening as his child practices English pronunciation. An elderly man staring thoughtfully at a letter from home, reading it once more before carefully placing it back into its envelope. It is in these quiet acts that the true story resides, not in the headlines, not in the speeches, but in the persistence of ordinary life under extraordinary constraint. In the next part, we will allow ourselves one final unhurried reflection on what this decade teaches about endurance, community, and the slow shaping of history through routine. No drama, just a gentle closing of the door. And so we arrive at something that feels less like an ending and more like a quiet exhale. The 1880s in San Francisco's Chinatown were not a dramatic crescendo in American history. They were not a golden age, nor were they a single catastrophic collapse. They were a decade of disciplined survival. If you measure history by wars and elections, this neighborhood might seem peripheral. But if you measure it by human endurance, by the repeated act of waking up and continuing under constraint, then Chinatown stands quietly at the center. What does endurance look like exactly? It looks like a man memorizing the details of his village for an immigration interview, then rising at dawn to scrub shirts without complaint. It looks like a child practicing English in the morning and copying Chinese characters in the afternoon, not fully aware that he is balancing two worlds. It looks like merchants extending credit to neighbors because reputation matters more than paperwork within those narrow streets. It looks like tea poured into small porcelain cups at the end of a long shift, steam rising gently in lamplight. Endurance is rarely loud. It does not demand applause. It does not announce itself as heroic. It simply continues. By the time the decade closed, Chinatown had absorbed restriction, scrutiny, overcrowding, and uncertainty, and had translated them into systems, associations, routines, mutual aid, adaptation. It had become, almost accidentally, permanent. That permanence would be tested in the decades to come. There would be disasters. There would be reinventions. There would be moments when the neighborhood would physically transform. But none of that erases the slow, methodical groundwork laid in the 1880s. If you imagine yourself there now, lying in a narrow bunk at the end of a long day, the air slightly heavy, the faint scent of rice lingering, you might feel tired, but not defeated. Tomorrow will require the same effort as today. The kettle will boil again. The laundry steam will rise again. The tobacco leaves will rustle again. The letters will be written again. And history, which so often prefers dramatic moments, will quietly accumulate in the background, unnoticed by those living it. We have two more gentle reflections to go before we close this walk entirely. For now, simply let the streets grow still. Let the oil lamps dim. Let the hum of work settle into memory. There is no rush. If we allow ourselves one more slow turn through these streets, we begin to notice something almost understated in its importance. The people of 1880s Chinatown were not trying to become symbols. They were not setting out to represent immigration policy, labor economics, or cultural resilience. They were trying to earn enough money to send home, to avoid detention, to keep their shops open, to sleep through the night without a knock at the door. And yet, over time, their very ordinariness became instructive. Because what survives across decades is not always spectacle. It is infrastructure built from repetition. It is trust maintained through small transactions. It is a network of relationships that functions even when external recognition is absent. Chinatown endured not because conditions were ideal, but because adaptation became habitual. When laws restricted entry, documentation became meticulous. When housing options narrowed, density was organized. When hostility flared, associations strengthened internal bonds. This was not romantic resilience. It was practical. There is a quiet discipline required to persist in a place that questions your permanence, to invest emotionally and economically in streets that others debate relocating, to raise children in classrooms that may not fully welcome them. And yet, by the end of the 1880s, that investment had already taken root. Young men who arrived as laborers had become shopkeepers. Errand boys had become clerks. Some elderly residents had spent more than half their lives within those few blocks. Their memories were embedded in the grain of wooden door frames, in the worn edges of work tables. If you asked them whether they were making history, they likely would have shrugged. History felt like washing another bundle of shirts, like measuring rice carefully to make it last, like reviewing a certificate of residence for the 10th time that month. It felt repetitive, and repetition, though rarely celebrated, is what builds communities. As the 1880s faded into the 1890s, Chinatown did not vanish. It did not dissolve under pressure. It tightened its networks. It adjusted its expectations. It continued. That continuation is perhaps the most remarkable part, precisely because it appears unremarkable at first glance. Tomorrow will come. Work will resume. Tea will be poured. Letters will be written. And the quiet architecture of endurance will hold. We have one final reflection left before we close this chapter entirely. Let us approach it slowly. There is no need to hurry toward the end. And now, gently, we let the decade settle. If you have walked with us slowly through 1880's San Francisco Chinatown, you may have noticed that nothing spectacular ever truly happened. No single moment defined it. No grand climax arrived. Instead, there was accumulation. Accumulation of steam on wooden ceilings. Accumulation of coins in small cloth pouches. Accumulation of letters folded and refolded. Accumulation of years spent telling oneself, just a little longer. For the men who scrubbed laundry until their fingers cracked, the decade was not a chapter in a textbook. It was a sequence of workdays. For the shopkeepers balancing accounts by lamplight, it was not an era of policy debates. It was rent due on the first of the month. And yet, without intending to, they built something enduring. They built institutions where none were offered. They built systems of credit and mediation when banks and courts were unreliable. They built bilingual children who could move between worlds more easily than their parents ever could. They built permanence in a city that described them as temporary. There is something quietly profound in that. The 1880s did not offer comfort. They did not offer acceptance. They did not offer legal security. But they did offer routine, and routine became foundation. If you close your eyes now and imagine the neighborhood at dusk one last time, you might see oil lamps glowing faintly behind thin curtains. You might hear the scrape of a chair as someone stands after finishing tea. You might smell tobacco, ginger, damp wood. Nothing dramatic, just life continuing. History often celebrates breakthroughs and disasters, but most of human existence, then as now, unfolds in repetition, in early mornings and tired evenings, in careful budgeting, in letters written home. That is what life was really like in 1880's San Francisco Chinatown. Not a legend, not a spectacle, a working neighborhood negotiating constraint with discipline and quiet endurance. And now the lamps dim, the streets soften, the kettle will boil again tomorrow. For tonight you can rest.